back to the Finding Genius video series. I'm joined with Carine Carmy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Uh, Car- Carine is the founder of Origin, and Origin is a provider of physical therapy services assisting in areas including fertility, sexual health, pregnancy, and menopause. And it sounds like you're off the back of starting up two more clinics in LA. So congratulations on that.
Thank you so
Um,
much.
Before we get into Origin and the story and the value you guys are providing, could we just holistically talk about the dialogue around women's health, how that's evolved in the last 10 to 15 years, uh, and maybe some of the pioneers and founders that you really respect in this space, but would just be good to get your firsthand accounts of how everything has evolved.
Happy to. And I think we'll go a little bit further back in time because I think that context is really important. You know, it's hard to not look at women's health through the context of gender bias in medicine. And that's truly because from the early days, we've been designing the healthcare system and frankly, the world around the male default body. And I don't know if you ever heard this, but the word hysteria actually comes from the word womb in Greek. And so we are
Wow.
training women from a very early age that their pain is not real and that what is happening to them is an aberration from the norm, and the norm is the male default. And obviously, I think intellectually and socially, the cultural tide winds have changed in a big way, but that's actually systemically built into our healthcare system. So, a couple examples. Until the 90s, you actually were not required to include women in clinical trials. And so the data around sex and medicine is really problematic, and it impacts both dosages of medications. It impacts how we treat issues like heart disease or, heart attacks. Women are more likely to be misdiagnosed around heart attacks because their
Wow.
signs and symptoms are not treated the same way. And unfortunately, even in medical schools, only 9 out of 95 medical schools in this study that was done, I forgot exactly the date, but not too long ago, have dedicated courses to women's health. And so when you think about women's health, there's almost a couple different ways of thinking about it. We often talk about women's health in the context of what happens in women, so reproductive health. But there's also disease areas like autoimmune diseases that are predominantly affecting women. And then there's diseases that present differently in women, like cardiac disease or heart disease. And I think what's so exciting is that in the last 10 to 15 years, the concept of women's health has shifted and expanded from simply looking at reproductive health, which in early days meant fertility, and that was
Right,
really the
right.
beginning, to a much more holistic understanding of how does primary care differ in women? How do we need to treat specialties? Or are there specific conditions like what we're doing at Origin that have been historically underlooked because of this systemic gender bias? And so that's been like
Wow.
that big thread. Yeah.
But then how far behind are we in terms of the quality of care that women are receiving based off of the clinical guidelines that are based off of false data or the drugs that have been produced for just
Yeah.
different illnesses and ailments? How far behind do you think we are? Are we have we caught up on that curve fairly quickly?
I don't think we're there yet at all. And I think that's both a massive challenge in the healthcare system because of how entrenched and how many players there are and the challenges of affecting change. But I do think the sentiment has shifted, right? So even in the last few years, you're seeing a desire to actually identify sex differences and how it impacts women around the drugs that we're taking or the way that we approach preventative care and things like that. So I think I'm excited because intellectually and socially, there's a movement behind this, but it's going
Right,
to take a
right.
long time. And it does take a long time because when you're a provider and you've been working and trained in a certain way, we know that behavior change is quite challenging. And so that's where bringing in technology or folks from the outside, but working within the healthcare system is a big opportunity. But truly, we have to redesign the healthcare system, and a lot of it actually has to do with preventative care and the front door because that's where so many of the issues happen around misdiagnosis. So, just in the context of what we see, you have 40 million women every year who are experiencing pelvic floor dysfunction, and they're not getting treated for the most part by the healthcare system until it's far too late. So, they're getting unnecessary surgeries that could have been treated with, early prevention. And
Wow.
and it's happening. Yeah, I mean, look, healthcare is broken. I think we know that in a big way, and it's not just about gender, it's also about race and those confounding factors. And when you look at the intersection of race and gender, in particular, Black women in this country are at risk for far worse outcomes than white women or even Hispanic women as well.
So I guess since we're on the topic of the dialogue and how things are changing, is this being acknowledged by the health systems and the leaders in healthcare as a problem or an issue that we're facing, or is there still more work to be done there?
There's definitely a lot of work to be done, and I think there is a sentiment that this needs to change. But part of the biggest challenge here is the data, right? So if we don't have sex disaggregated data across the conditions in which affect a large population of women but are not just for women, that's a problem. That data doesn't really exist yet. And then if you look at issues that are really only in women, we have far fewer clinical studies around impacts around pregnancy, pain. For example, there's 5 times the number of studies around erectile dysfunction in men than there is on dyspareunia or painful sex in women. And one is about pleasure and one is about pain. And that's, a big area we're focused on, but that's going to take years, frankly, to change. And I think a shift in incentives as well.
That's interesting. So when you look at the women's health ecosystem and then
Hmm.
digital providers, and you look at the founders that were building things, kind of through that context of seeing what was out there and what folks were building towards, and these are some
Yeah.
really incredible founders in the space. Where did you see the opportunity for Origin, and maybe for folks that haven't been engaged with Origin before? I'm sure there's very few, but
Yeah.
maybe you can give a sense of what the business is and what the origin of Origin was. I'm sure that's the
Sure.
first time that joke was made, but
We chose the name for a reason. I'm a brand person, so I'm like, let's just
yeah,
embed this
right.
in everyone's mind. No, but I've been really inspired by, I think, the early pioneers in the space, companies like Wildflower or Maven. And obviously, there's been so much innovation on the fertility side as well, although there's a big gap still to be done. And so I think, look, the uphill battles that we're facing, those founders, 5, 10 years ago, not just from a healthcare standpoint, but a funding standpoint, are real. And I think the market is shifting in a big way. So thank you to everyone who's paved the road. And even in the last few years, I've seen an explosion in companies, both from a services standpoint and intervention, even like CPG products really targeting very specific aspects of women's health. But what really inspired us in the origin story started a few years ago. I'd been in health and tech for a long time, various startups and emerging technologies, and really just interested in how technology and kind of the consumer delivery of that can change behaviors and hopefully empower people throughout their lives. And I took some time off from my last company and was exploring what was next. And I met up with my old friend from high school, who's now my co-founder, Nona. And she had just had a baby and was 5 months postpartum, and her body was still wrecked, and no one was helping her. So she had neck and shoulder pain from carrying her son, and her abs were still separated, which is very common, and she was having pelvic pain. And, she's 5 months postpartum, has access to what's supposed to be incredible healthcare, and still was in the dark. And it connected the dots for my own experience when I was in my 20s. I was living in New York and also had access to great healthcare, was having painful sex, which impacts 1 in 6 women. It's a very common condition. And I went to 8 different OBs. Like, I had to go to these very ultra specialists, which shouldn't be the case if it's this common. Had 2 biopsies. And at the end of the day, it was like, well, maybe it'll just go away over time. So obviously a very frustrating experience. And we both learned through our conversations that physical therapy is actually the first line evidence-based treatment for these issues. And what's the umbrella term is called pelvic floor dysfunction, or some of these full body orthopedic issues around pregnancy, postpartum, and menopause. But the market at the time, I mean, still now is highly fragmented. It looks like mental health 5, 10 years ago. It's a lot of independent practitioners working on their own. And I think most of them are not taking insurance because it doesn't make sense often if you're,
Right.
solo. And so there's a huge access gap, right? If you have 40 million women in the US with these issues and only 5,000 providers nationwide, we have to think about a different care delivery model. So we joined up and partnered with our third co-founder, David, who's known as husband. So they're my other marriage, and I talk to them way too much in bed. But it's been a wild ride, and our vision is ultimately, frankly, to change the standard of care. PT should really, especially around postpartum care, just be status quo. You should get it as something when you leave the hospital, like let's set up that visit. But there's also far more prevention opportunities as well, so that women are not choosing between adult diapers for incontinence
Right.
or surgery.
Right.
And so, yeah, we're building a network of clinics and some digital products as well.
And so how did you get started with this? I mean, in those for early days when you were thinking about it, was it more thinking about payers and getting clinicians on board to prescribe this for folks that are coming in with those types of pains, or was it more around we need to go and actually find more patients that we can work with?
So we took a pretty unique path, I think, for a digital healthcare startup in that we identified a partner in LA. It was a women's health PT clinic, very few that kind of fit that model. But we're really aligned with the treatment philosophy, how they approached care, and we ended up partnering with that clinic and that clinical team. And so that became the foundation of our clinical care program. And what we learned in that is that, obviously we care a lot about brand and we're doing a lot to elevate awareness, but demand is not the problem. It's really, let's build a more scalable way to introduce this care. So we spent our early days on operations, on payer contracting, and making this accessible, so that it's not $300 a visit for patients, but it's,
Right.
your $30 copay instead.
And I guess the shift in the US towards value-based care has been more around the focus of outcomes based, and that's how are you measuring, or is it too early right now, the data on how the outcomes are changing as a result of PT, or has there already been
Yeah.
studies on that and that's what you're basing it off of? Or are you guys pioneers in this space and saying, okay, these are the outcomes that we're going to drive the entire shift towards value-based care in this space also?
It's both. So I see a huge opportunity for us to support and lead on clinical research. And we're in conversations with a lot of academic medical centers on that exactly, just because in our population, we're seeing thousands of visits a month in a very
Right,
specific population. That's ripe for data collection
right,
and research. And unfortunately, the research has just been relatively thin. However, what it does show are some really powerful impacts. So just looking at pregnancy, for example, prevention during kind of physical therapy as a preventative aspect of pregnancy can lead to shorter time in labor, less likelihood of tearing and episiotomies, and better postpartum outcomes. So, I mean, even just for all my friends who are pregnant right now, I'm like, just do this because, I know it works and your life will be much better. There's also some research because physical therapy, we think about it as manual therapy, but a lot of it is actually education and body empowerment. And there's a direct correlation between postpartum PT and reduction in risk in depression as well, postpartum. And so there's a lot of amazing signals for what we're doing. And if you look at France, every person who delivers a child gets pelvic floor PT after they give birth. But we're in the early days, I think, of fully explaining that to the market with data.
that's interesting. And from I guess patient might be the wrong word here,
Yeah.
but I guess from your customers or patients or however you view them, when you're thinking about it, there is an awareness gap, especially since you're saying that the data hasn't always been there. Someone is having painful sex or they're having issues during postpartum, they go to a
Yeah.
doctor, they're being prescribed medication that probably isn't right for them, or they're going through some different clinical pathway that also probably isn't right. How do you create enough awareness with women in the US, especially since you're saying other countries are already far advanced on this, to
Hmm.
know that they should come in for PT? And is
Yeah.
that kind of focused on your brand, or how is that one of the bigger challenges that you're facing now? How do you think about that?
Yeah. To me, that's the most exciting thing. And I don't know, I helped launch Shapeways, which is a 3D printing company. It was like at the
Right.
early days of the market. So I love category creation. And I think in this case, we have such a unique, powerful opportunity to empower women in their bodies. Like, I didn't even know I had a pelvic floor until I went through all that crap in my 20s. And just to know it and to have a name for what was going on is life changing. And so for me, it's really personal. And when I think about marketing, there's a few things. Women are already seeking care, right? So they're already going online. They're already stitching together these birth workers and support systems. And so part of what we have to do is just help people understand, what does this mean and why is this something you might want to consider as part of your plan of
Right.
care.
Right.
So I think the behaviors are already there. It's really about education and explanation, and that's been really fun around both leveraging our existing patient base who have those results and having them tell their own stories. And that's really core. Over half of our patients come via word of mouth. It's really a referral based network, I think, in the early days too. I believe in kind of that organic early days. And then there's obviously a ton of content and education that we're doing. But we're also trying to have fun. So we just opened up
Yeah.
a clinic in West Hollywood, and we're in this little strip that's, next to like this famous juice place and across from a restaurant and Kings Road Cafe. And we have on our window, it says the best Kegels south of Sunset. So, we're
Interesting.
trying to make this also just something that, like, our clinic in Brentwood is right next to this LA restaurant, John and Vinny's. I'm like, pick up your pizza, check out your pelvic floor.
Right,
It
right.
doesn't have to be so serious. And I think framing it in the context of wellness and self-care is something that we also pride ourselves on.
Interesting. So on the operational standpoint, when you think
Yeah.
about the clinics that you're launching, um, how did you think about that from a cost perspective compared to other physical therapy? I mean, it's a completely different business model, but and
Yeah.
then the slow shift towards becoming a digital provider during COVID. How has everything evolved for you guys in the short period of time that you've been doing this?
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
not short
from
period of
a,
time, but short in the
no, no,
grand
no.
scheme of women's health.
It's,
But
yeah, I know. We're dropping the bucket, but hopefully we'll be upon soon. I just made that up. That's good. I like it. Write it
that
down.
was
No,
good. Yeah.
thanks. I don't usually get like the good
I'll
idioms.
be at the
So
next clinic. Yeah.
exactly. Um, a couple questions in there, but I think for us, a few things have always been true. You want to create a beautiful space that people feel safe in and they're comfortable, but we also don't need to spend millions of dollars on opening clinics. And I think part of that is this shift, right? So One Medical came into the market and they said, like, let's make healthcare more fun and beautiful, and then really change the dynamic. And I kind of call that consumer health 1.0. Now the question is, how do we actually do things differently? So not just take the real world and bring it online, but actually use digital technologies to reframe healthcare delivery. And that, from our digital standpoint, was a huge unlock. And so we were always thinking of having telehealth services and digital therapeutics and kind of just a much more holistic offering than just one-on-one PT in person. In pre-COVID days, insurance companies were not reimbursing for PT virtually at all. So there was no reimbursement there. So that was kind of a thwarting signal. We were always going to plan for it, but we had some
Right.
more work to do there. COVID happened. We had to basically have a telehealth product in 24 hours or lose our customer base. So we got it up and running. We trained our team and launched online booking at the same time. We were like, all right,
Wow.
we're gonna do this whole thing, and it was eye opening just how valuable that virtual experience was for our patients. Not just from a, hey, I'm busy and I don't want to come in, twice a week, but also like I can do things differently virtually than I can in person. So that was, the kind of COVID evolution. It really opened our eyes to the power of care delivery online, and now we're thinking in that kind of next phase. So not just let's take what we do in person and do it virtually, but how can we create more scalable educational interventions and therapeutic interventions using technology? So that's kind of what's cooking and coming soon.
That's interesting. Can you give us a sneak
Yeah.
peek of where things go from here, especially since
Yeah.
you've kind of unlocked this new care delivery model and you're probably unlocking customers in new geographies also as a result of it.
Yeah.
Could you give us a taste of some of that? What's next?
Yeah. So we're focused still. I mean, clinical expansion, in-person expansion is still core to the business, and we kind of talk about omni-channel or hybrid model. So in markets where we have locations, we'll continue to serve patients both in person and virtually, and they'll have access to all the other digital programs that we're expanding upon. And I think for many reasons, it's valuable to have in-person care, but especially with kind of a new category, just being able to like see someone and talk to them and just
Right.
have that touch is very valuable. And I'd say about 20% of the diagnoses we treat, it is actually important to have in-person manual therapy. But we're building out a full digital program and platform, and a lot of it is rooted in theories of behavior change, but also just the baseline education. So, the entire kind of OBGYN journey around your pregnancy and postpartum, just taking that use case, is so oriented around the baby and not the mother and what's going on in her body. And the number one thing we hear from our patients at every stage of life is, no one prepared me, no one told me like what is happening to me. And so there's a lot of that education that we can do virtually, without having to have 40 million PTs for the 40 million women nationally.
Interesting. I guess this is, could you talk to us candidly about what fundraising for a business like this, what the experience has been? Um,
Yeah.
there's lack of awareness about the problem, so there's that piece, and then uh, I guess there's different elements to it. So it'd be great to just hear how your experience has been there, and
Yeah.
you've done it successfully. So what strategies you might be able to share with other people, and kind of what your
Yeah.
frustrations were in terms of what you think VCs need to evolve and how they think about things too. It'd just be great to hear your perspective.
I'm like, let me take a deep breath before I release all my frustrations. No, no, honestly, I think the VC world has woken up to women's health as a category.
Right.
I do hope it doesn't become tokenized, and by that I mean, I think there was some experiences we had where it's like, oh well, we already have our one women's health company,
Ah,
right?
interesting.
And
Okay.
so I think that's a misnomer. And if you look at that category, you could have entire funds, and there are entire funds dedicated to women's health.
So,
And when you think about it that way too, it's obviously it's not only the reproductive health issues, but more broadly, and women are also making 80% of healthcare decisions for their families. So there's a massive category here, and healthcare is obviously one of the biggest categories financially in the United States too. Um, I think that the market has changed. When we started the business, early days, there was just not an understanding that women's health could be more than fertility. So
right.
many of the early companies who've done amazingly well, and I'm so glad they exist, but they defined the market, in that context. And I'll never forget, one of my first conversations with an investor in 2018 when we were just starting, and I was kind of explaining and testing the market. And they're like, well, pregnancy is niche, so I don't really understand how you're going to build a business here. And yeah, so clearly, not everyone gets it. And I think like any investments, you not just in women's health, but a lot of investors we spoke to bring their own biases. So um, either lack of awareness, but more often, oh, I my wife didn't use PT and she's fine, so I guess it's not really necessary. Um, so I think but that's true with, I think, any
Right.
business in which the investor doesn't necessarily resonate. But I'm thrilled, like our partners that we've brought on board in this round, it's really diverse from a gender standpoint. Some of our biggest advocates are men. So I don't think it's actually a problem just with male VCs. I think it's really, frankly, good investors versus, the
Right.
rest.
Right. Right. Interesting. That's really interesting. And I guess for other women's health founders, or maybe even since that's such a niche space of
Yeah.
pregnancy, but no, okay, the women's
Oh,
health founders that you would have experience or advice for when they are going to launch a business in the space, and then just broader healthcare founders
yeah.
too, where do you see folks tripping on themselves when they are launching these
Yeah.
businesses, or common pitfalls that they're facing? Uh,
Yeah.
and in that same framework, who are some founders that you think have done a really good job recently of
Totally.
navigating some of that?
You know, um, I think the pitfalls are less on the founder side necessarily in the pitch or anything else, but it's really more like what type of business are you building, and is it a VC capitalized business? And so I think I'm seeing a lot of companies in the space that are, let's say, CPG products that, tackle a very specific line within the industry. And you could build an entire empire, and that would be, a VC backed business. But
Right,
I think
right,
some of those founders I'm seeing having a hard time raising because it's the question of like, how big is this market? And, the classic questions that you're going to get. And so I'm sure I'm not the first one to say this, but I think a lot about not just product market fit, but product market capital fit. And let's make sure that all of those align and that this is actually a venture funded business. And if it's not, like, there's so many other ways to raise capital, but I just don't think we talk about those as much,
right,
and like there's
right.
the startup Silicon Valley,
Yeah,
narrative as well. Um, so I think that's just one big question of like, what kind of business are you building, and is it really VC backed? And really, I think what I'm hearing from VCs too is that everyone is kind of looking for someone to like own the entire market. I don't necessarily believe in that, but that is a bias right now. So like, are you going to become the horizontal player that's going to dominate, all of women's health for everyone? And obviously, I think that's maybe a little
right.
bit too extreme of a view, but that's where I think the market's mind is right now, and why there's also the I already have my player, like, checkbox, like we're good,
Yeah.
because it's viewed in a
Well, but how
competitive
do
way.
you see it? How do you see it operating most effectively? Is it verticalized, where it's on different phases of the health cycle, it's different symptoms? How do you see it, or do you just see it as being the whole new health system?
I mean, I think we're developing an entirely new ecosystem. So, we're developing partnerships with even fertility companies or primary care providers. So, like, we slot in nicely.
Right,
You can
right.
imagine there's also, this whole field of care coordination, which is a big gap in healthcare for women. You give birth and you need to have a lactation consultant and a doula and
Yeah,
all these
yeah,
other
yeah,
people. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
I think it's almost like saying, in financial services, should there just be like, one
Right.
company that's credit cards and
Right.
I
Right.
do
Right.
think we're
Right.
going to see a lot of consolidation in the next 5 to 10 years. Like there's a lot of innovation and a lot of companies, and so it's natural that you're going to start to see some more kind of pieces connecting the dots. I conjecture, like I think a little bit less around, okay, what is this going to look like exactly? But I think for us as a brand and a business, like let's just do what we're doing really, really well. There's a huge opportunity just in our space right now, and if it makes sense to add new verticals into what we're doing, we will. If we're not delivering care effectively because we don't have the right, horizontal components, we'll extend. But I think with healthcare, you have to earn the right to do that, and we want to be very careful about quality of care as kind of the core underpinning of what we do.
Right. Carine, this was really helpful and very
Yeah,
insightful. Thank you so much for your time.
of course, this was a pleasure,
Appreciate it.
and for all the founders out there, just do it. Keep trucking. My first year sucked, so
Yeah, exactly. Thank you so much.
thank you.